they led Jesus away to the high priest, and all the chief priests and the elders and scribes gathered together. Peter had followed him at a distance right into the courtyard of the high priest, and he was sitting with the officers and warming himself at the fire. Now the chief priests and the whole council kept trying to obtain testimony against Jesus to put him to death. They were not finding any. For many were giving false testimony against him, but their testimony was not consistent. Some stood up and began to give false testimony against him, saying, "We heard him say, 'I will destroy this temple made with hands, and in 3 days I'll build another one without hands.' Not even in this respect was their testimony consistent." The high priest stood up and came forward and questioned Jesus, saying, "Do you not answer? What is it that these men are testifying against you?" But he kept silent and he did not answer. Again, the high priest was questioning him and saying to him, "Are you the Christ, the Son of the Blessed One?" And Jesus said, "I am. And you shall see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of power, coming in with the clouds of heaven." Tearing his clothes, the high priest said, "What further need do we have of witnesses? You've heard the blasphemy. How does it seem to you?" And they all condemned him to be deserving of death. Some began to spit at him and to blindfold him and to beat him with their fists and to say to him, "Prophesy!" And the officers received him with slaps in the face. You can be seated. The United States has a very protective and advanced legal system. For a person to be arrested in our country, there must be probable cause or at least a warrant given by a judge. For a person to be held in jail or in custody, there must be some kind of appearance before a judge. And there must be at least some kind of plausible evidence, as well as a charge. You can't arrest somebody and hold them without charging them with something. For a person to be executed, there has to be a trial, of course, and a conviction. He has ability to have a jury of his peers, and if it's a capital crime, he has access to a wide array of options in the sentencing phase of the trial. In every case, a defendant is innocent until proven guilty. He is allowed to cross-examine and confront his accusers face to face, and he's protected from having to give testimony against himself. He can't incriminate himself. I mean, every middle school civics student in our country learns these basic principles. They're taken for granted. They're part and parcel of our legal system. They're all enshrined, memorized, engraved. On May 2nd, 1911, state of Oklahoma, a group of sheriff's deputies were serving a warrant looking for a stolen cow. They came across a farm. They saw obvious evidence that the cow had been there. He was butchered, but the hide was there with the brand, and it was very obvious this is the family that had stolen the cow. The deputies raided the farm, entered the house. The husband there quickly confessed to stealing the cow. There was no ambiguity about it. He confessed, and he was being taken into custody. While that was happening in the living room, in the next room over, there was a scuffle between the mother and her 14-year-old son. Apparently there had been a rifle hidden back there. The son had grabbed the rifle and he wanted to fight to protect his father from the jailers. The mom was wrestling with the son over the rifle. Eventually the two separated. Meanwhile, the deputies retreated to a different part of the house. The mother and the son separated. A shot rang out, killing one of the sheriff's deputies. The rest of the deputies took both the mother and the 14-year-old into custody, arrested them. Now, it was very obvious that only one of them did the shooting. They were fighting over the gun. They had been separated. There's one gun, one shot, two people, two different parts of the room. There were lots of witnesses to this. It wasn't just the family that was there. There were workers at the house. There were all kinds of people that saw this. All the deputies were there, but it was going to take some time to investigate. And so I think reasonably enough, they arrested both of them and took them to jail. Over the next few weeks, they did interviews, and there's no ballistics evidence in 1911, but they pieced it together and went before a judge, and the judge asked for the next day for them to be brought back before, and the judge was going to release one of them, and only the judge and the police knew which one that was going to be. Well, some detectives from a neighboring city arrived that night and asked to be led into the jail and had the jail opened up and then allowed a crowd from the town into the jail, and they took the mother and the 14-year-old out of jail and beat them and then hung them from the main bridge that ran through the middle of the city. They weren't content with one of them being let go. They needed to pay for their crime, and so both of them, the 14-year-old and his mom, were publicly hanged. The bodies left there. People took pictures of them. Pictures circulated. They made postcards out of them and sold postcards. This happened in Oklahoma early in its existence as a state. The governor from the neighboring state, Kansas, decried this and demanded that the United States Senate investigate and find those responsible and punish them for this crime. Now, what's interesting is the governor of Oklahoma said, there's no way this could have happened. And there's, again, postcards circulating of this happening, but he said there's no way this could have happened because we have in our Constitution due process. We have in our Constitution that anybody who's accused of a crime has to go before a judge. He's not going to be executed. He has to have a trial, and he's allowed to confront his or her accusers and the whole appeal system, and there has to be, there's a trial with a jury. So this couldn't have happened because it'd be a violation of our legal principles. I tell you that introduction because when you read about the trial of Jesus, it's so easy to view it as perhaps a miscarriage of justice, perhaps the wrong result of a trial. I want you to read about the trial of Jesus through the same way that you would read about the execution of Laura and L.D. Nelson were their names. And it became one of the most infamous lynching cases in our country's history. This wasn't an actual trial. This wasn't an actual conviction, an actual execution. What happened to Jesus was a perverse miscarriage of justice. It was incredibly offensive. It was a violation of every single legal principle that was enshrined in Israel's history. To this day, many Jewish leaders say the trial of Jesus could not have happened like it's described in Scripture. There's no way it could have happened, because that would be a violation of the legal principles of Israel. They wouldn't have allowed that to happen. Let me give you some examples of that. 2,000 years ago, in the Israelite legal system, it had the most advanced legal system in the world. It all began back in Deuteronomy 16, where God told Moses, you'll establish judges in every area of Israel. Those judges will be impartial, God said, and they will pursue justice. They're not allowed to have a vested interest in the case that they hear, and they will, above everything else, pursue justice. Deuteronomy 19 lays out the statutes of evidence that can be allowed in trial. Deuteronomy 19 says any testimony has to come from at least 2 or 3 witnesses. You can't allow testimony from only one witness in a criminal case. Not allowed. And the testimony from 2 or 3 witnesses, it has to agree exactly as to the manner of date, time, and place of the crime. If the testimony disagrees, then the case is dismissed. That's all back from the book of Deuteronomy. By Jesus' lifetime, it had gone even more and more advanced. By Jesus' lifetime, they had this huge, elaborate legal system in Israel. And like I said, it was the most elaborate and protective legal system in the world. In fact, much of American jurisprudence is based off of this Israelite system that was in place during the life of Jesus Christ. In the Israelite system, charges had to be filed before an arrest could be made. And that way, it's even more protective than the American system. In the American system, you can arrest somebody, and you've got, a day or two before you can charge them. Not in Israel. You have to go before a judge, present evidence, and get charges filed before you're allowed to arrest the person. All testimony, as I said, as Deuteronomy mentions, has to come from 2 or 3 witnesses. And if the testimony contradicts in a significant way, the case is immediately dismissed. It's not held over for a jury. They don't get to wade through it. The judge immediately dismisses the case. The idea being that the prosecution should have sorted through the witness testimonies before they brought charges, much less at a trial. Moreover, if a witness was found to be giving false testimony, that witness was going to receive the punishment that the accused would have received had he been found guilty. So to use a really common example in Israel's history, if someone was accused of stealing, the punishment in the Torah was to repay 4-fold what they stole. If you were to testify in a criminal trial about a man who stole, and then 2 or 3 other witnesses gave testimony that contradicted yours, then you would receive the punishment for the crime. You would have to repay fourfold, even though you're not even accused of the theft. In a capital case, like murder or blasphemy, if you give false testimony, you will be the one who's executed. This is the way the legal system in Israel works. Every defendant in the legal system there had the right to remain silent. He did not have to give testimony. Moreover, every defendant had the right to cross-examine anybody who was bringing testimony against him. He could confront his accusers and question them. If a judge was involved with the gathering of evidence, then that judge could not be involved in the hearing of the case. And that was very common in these small Israelite towns, because usually it was the synagogue leader who was the judge, and the synagogue leader would often be the one people would turn to help investigate something. So if the synagogue leader was the one who investigated the charge and listened to the evidence before bringing charges, he was not allowed to sit in on the trial. They'd have to bring in a judge from another town. Trials were not allowed to begin in the late afternoon, kind of like the 12 Angry Men mentality. They thought if a trial began in the late afternoon, the judge might rush to judgment so he could get home to his family. So they weren't allowed to begin in the late afternoon. And if a trial began earlier in the day and it was taking all day, they had to adjourn with enough time for everybody to walk back to their house. And they would pick up the trial again the next day. There would never be a nighttime trial. Guilt on a capital crime required 2 different votes at the appellate level. At the appellate level, you'd have a panel of judges, just like the American legal system today. Say there's 5 judges that hear the appeal. If it was a death penalty case, they would hear it and they would vote on guilt or innocence after the trial. But then if they voted guilty, they had to spend a full day fasting and then reconvene after that and do a second vote. This would make it impossible for anybody to be executed on a feast day. If the trial was held the day before the feast day, you couldn't fast on the feast day, so you would fast the day after that. If the feast day was a Friday, such as Passover, then you wouldn't meet again to vote on Saturday either. So in reality, there's no way that somebody could be tried on Thursday and executed at all before Sunday or Monday. And we don't know what the devil was thinking in the particular case of Jesus' trial, but it's likely that this could have been in his mind. You know, earlier in Jesus' ministry, the devil wanted to keep Jesus from the cross. He offered him, anything to keep him from going to the cross, and Jesus, of course, refused. But this Passion Week here, suddenly the devil shifts tactics and wants Jesus to be crucified, fills Judas and leads Judas to betray Jesus, perhaps thinking there's no way if he's betrayed on Thursday, that he could possibly be crucified on Friday, as the prophecies demanded. And so the devil would still be vindicated. We don't, again, know what Satan was thinking, but it's likely it could have been that. Not only all of this, but any defendant would have the opportunity to appeal his sentence. The Supreme Court of Israel was the Sanhedrin. That's what it was called. It was a court with 70 judges on it. 70. It's almost like our Senate and Supreme Court combined. This comes from Numbers chapter 11, where Moses was told to establish 70 elders to help him rule Israel. Well, from Numbers to the time of Jesus, this had grown into the Sanhedrin. It's very important for you to understand the Sanhedrin, for you to get the full weight of the travesty that happens at Jesus' trial. This was the Supreme Court, 70 members. 24 of them were the chief priests. Israel was split into 24 priestly districts. The head priests from each of those districts sat on the Sanhedrin. They would only be together very infrequently, but in Passover week, such as now, they would all be in Jerusalem, so they were all there. The other 46 were filled out from the scribes, the Sadducees, and the Pharisees. Those 46 brought the number to 70. The scribes, Sadducees, and Pharisees were more or less represented in equal number. They received a lifetime appointment. When you were appointed, you were there for life. You were appointed by the high priest. It was an incredibly powerful and influential position to have. The high priest would only vote in a trial of the Sanhedrin in case of a tie. So 35 on one side, 35 on the other side. The high priest would he tip his hand and show which way he was leaning. Votes on the Sanhedrin were very orchestrated. After listening to all the evidence, the 70 members would vote, starting with the junior member of the Sanhedrin, starting from the guy who'd been on the council the shortest amount of time. And the votes would be taken in ascending order all the way up, if needed, to the high priest. That way, the idea behind that is that nobody would be influenced by a more senior member giving their vote. It would be the newest guy who had to vote first. He couldn't just watch what other people were doing. Charges would have to be initiated with another court before they could be brought to the Sanhedrin. The Sanhedrin was not a court of first strikes. You couldn't go there initially. They couldn't hear any case for the first time. They were only for appeals. And as I said, they were led by the high priest. Now, during Jesus' lifetime, there's two high priests, and so people get confused by reading this. There was one who was actually the high priest, and another one who actually had the power of the high priest. And let me explain how that works. I know this is a lot of background information, but I think it's really essential to understanding this trial. Annas was the high priest, 20 years earlier. He was a very powerful and influential leader of the Sanhedrin. He was a guy you didn't mess with. When his term was over, high priests were termed out. When his term was over, he replaced himself with one of his sons. He went through 5 sons. All of them reached their term limit, but Annas was still the one who was wielding the power. He was in charge. There was no mystery about that. After he went through his 5 sons, the next high priest was a guy named Caiaphas, who was Annas' son-in-law. And beyond that, he actually lived with Annas. His son-in-law lived in the same house. Again, there's no mystery about who was actually wielding the power. And this whole court, by the end of Annas' lifetime here, it operated almost like a modern-day mafia. They were the ones that ruled the temple, the Sanhedrin. They are the ones that set the laws. For you to do a sacrifice in the temple, you had to buy one of their animals. You had to use their currency to buy their animal, their currency that you could only get in the temple, and they charged a hefty exchange rate. You had to use their animals with their money, following their rules. Thus, it was a very, very lucrative system they had set up, Annas did. Obviously, Annas was the one leading this because when Jesus was arrested, he wasn't brought first to the Sanhedrin. He was brought first to Annas. This is only recorded in John 18. In John 18, Jesus went first to Annas. Annas tried to interrogate him. Annas began the interrogation by saying, "Tell me about your teaching," after arresting Jesus in the middle of the night. "Tell me what your teaching is. What's your doctrine?" To which Jesus told him, "I've been in the temple all week long preaching in front of 10,000 people. Why don't you ask one of them?" And it was there Jesus received the first of many blows that night. He was struck in the head by one of the temple guards. From there, he was ushered over to the Sanhedrin, where he faced the full council. Now, we're going to go through his trial here in front of the Sanhedrin. Let me give you a little outline. It's going to start with the phases of his trial. First, the prosecution. The prosecution. Jesus deserves death. Begins in verse 53. They led Jesus away to the high priest, and all the chief priests and elders and scribes gathered together. And that's possibly describing what happened in John 18, where he went first to Annas. Well, the Sanhedrin gathered together. You couldn't get the Sanhedrin together in the middle of the night. It was obvious they had been planning this for quite some time. Judas had agreed to betray Jesus all the way back on Saturday night. They finally got their hands on him on Thursday night, and so it was that time period they had got their pieces together in the right place for this trial. Now, you really have to remember that Jesus started his temple ministry with the showdown with the Sanhedrin. He brought everything that was happening in the temple to a halt. He rebuked the money changers. He turned over the tables. He drove out the animals. He brought it all to a halt, and he began preaching in the temple all week long. This was costing the Sanhedrin a lot of money. It would be like taking over the shopping malls. It'd be like taking over Tyson's Corner the week before Christmas. People are not going to let that happen. Jesus took over the temple Passover week. This was their most lucrative week. The Sanhedrin was furious. They had the showdown, remember, earlier in the Gospel of Mark, it's recorded. They came to Jesus and asked him what gives him the right to be there in the temple. He responded to them by telling them a parable about a vineyard owner who sent his son to the ones who were renting the vineyard to get the money that the vineyard workers owed the vineyard owner. And instead of paying, the vineyard workers killed the vineyard owner's son. Now, Mark lets us know the crowd had no idea why Jesus told that story. They didn't get it, but the Sanhedrin got it. Jesus was claiming to be God's son. They were the trespassers in the vineyard, and he was going to expel them, but they were first going to kill him. Everybody knew what everybody was going to do at that moment. The Sanhedrin knew they were going to kill Jesus. Jesus knew he was going to be murdered by them. It was all out in the open. They just had to wait until this night to do it. Now they're gathered together. Verse 54 describes Peter. We'll get back to Peter next week, so skip that verse for now. Verse 55, the chief priests of the whole council kept trying to obtain testimony against Jesus to put him to death. As we go through this, I want you to understand all those legal principles in Israelite law that we talked about earlier, they break every single one of them in this trial. Every single legal principle that they held, they violate in this trial. And that's why it's recorded with such detail. You're supposed to understand this is not a real trial. This is not a real court. There is no semblance of legitimacy at all to what happens here. This is a kangaroo court with witnesses who are liars, charges that are trumped up, and judges who have been bribed. There is nothing legitimate about what happens here. They begin by trying to find some kind of witness that can give them something to charge him with. We have Jesus, we're going to kill him. Now let's find a crime to charge him with. That's their attitude here. We know how this ends, just what's the details in the paperwork here. So they start parading in witnesses to accuse him of things. This is the opposite of the way it's supposed to work. But they couldn't find anything to charge him with. This is incredible. Every word he said for the last 3 years has been eavesdropped upon. They know what he said. They know what he taught. They know things he said in passing, and they can't find anything to accuse him of. Every step he made the last 3 years has been followed, and they can't find anything to accuse him of. Understand the sinless nature of Jesus Christ here. They watched him, they listened to him, and they can't accuse him of anything after 3 years of his ministry. How would you do in this kind of circumstance? If I could follow you for 48 hours, I'd have enough to convict you on. They followed Jesus for 3 years. I talked to an FBI agent this week who said there's so many federal crimes, so many federal laws, that everybody is guilty of breaking one of them at any moment in time. It's just to drive home the point that we're guilty. That's the way the Israelite law was. Everybody is guilty. They've all broken some part of the Torah. It was so complex. It was so burdensome. They've all broken it. And yet, after watching Jesus for 3 years, they can't find anything to charge him with. Verse 56 says, many were giving false testimony against him, but their testimony was inconsistent, which means the trial should be over and Jesus should go home. Not tonight. Not in this court. Some stood up and began to give false testimony against him, saying, we heard him say, I will destroy this temple made with hands. In 3 days I'll build another one without hands. Now, did Jesus say that? Not really. He said something like it in John chapter 2. If you remember, and that was 3 years earlier. They had to go back all 3 years, and they found some line that he said when he cleansed the temple the first time in John 2, and he actually said, you can destroy this temple, and I'll build it back in 3 days. He didn't say he was going to destroy it. They went back 3 years. They garbled his words, intentionally misconstruing them to make it sound like he said he would destroy the temple, and that's not even true. And Mark points out that in even this, verse 59, their testimony wasn't consistent. They couldn't come up with anything that would stick. And they had a low threshold right here, right? I mean, they are not going through this with a fine-tooth comb. Anything plausible they'll charge him with, because they already know they're going to execute him. He's guilty. But even with that super low threshold, they couldn't find anything that even sounded plausible to them. They're in quite a pickle here. Verse 60. Finally, the high priest stood up, came forward and questioned Jesus, saying, do you not answer? What is it that these men are testifying to you? This would have been an incredibly intimidating arena. I went to a trial in the United States Supreme Court a few weeks ago, and what an intimidating place. It begins in the street. You walk up those steps, which they have I read a book about the architecture of it. It was intentionally designed to intimidate people. You're supposed to walk up. You're out of breath by the time you get there, ascending this mountain up to justice. You walk into this room with all these different lions and all these different searches and all these different people glaring at you, and you get into this room with these epic curtains and these massive pillars and this bench that's raised up for these 9 judges. Some of those judges will fit in your pocket. They're so small, but when they sit up there on that bench, they look down at you and you are like you're shrinking. It's so intimidating. That big clock above tick, tick, and they start right on time, and they are pushing through, and everybody is anxious, and the lawyers are trying to get as much time as they can. They won't stop talking, and the judges keep interrupting them, and everybody feels small. And then there's all these guards that are there, the court marshals, and they don't make eye contact with the judges. They stand with their backs to the judges and just glare at everybody there, just staring at you, and you feel threatened. These people are mean-looking people. Apologies if any of you have that job. I mean, you looked at them and you're like, man, there are 10 ways that person could kill me right now, and they're going through the 10 in their mind, I can tell. You accidentally cough and you're like, uh-oh. they're zoning in here. It's over for me. The Sanhedrin, they met in a room, 70 judges, not 9, 70, with the high priest in the middle. It was a horseshoe-shaped table they sat on. They had a room specially built for this. It was a horseshoe-shaped thing that roped around. The judges were elevated. The one who was giving testimony or who was on trial stood down in the middle. So all the judges were looking down at him. And then on the floor, it was patrolled by these guards with clubs. So you stood down looking up at these judges, and in the case of Jesus, they are berating him. They are demanding that he speak up. The high priest stands up and says, "Why don't you talk?" And the whole time, Jesus is silent. He refuses to dignify this charade with an answer. Not only that, he has the legal right in the Israelite law customs there. He has the legal right to remain silent. He doesn't have to incriminate himself. He doesn't have to say anything. He has the right to cross-examine his witnesses, and they haven't found any witnesses. Even in this horrible case of injustice, Jesus is still availing himself of the rights of the legal system. He is still submissive to the government that's above him, even now. And they're hounding him, "Why won't you speak?" The verb tense, verse 61, he kept silent. It means he kept on. It's a progressive. He was remaining silent the whole time. He did not dignify their false charges, their bribed accusations. He didn't dignify these lies with an answer. Because if he could be baited into this discussion, it would have a sense of legitimacy to it. Right now, it's entirely illegitimate. That's the prosecution, though, that Jesus deserves death. From there, let's move to the defense. The defense that Jesus deserves glory. That Jesus deserves glory. Caiaphas, the high priest, Matthew lets us know this is Caiaphas, not Annas. It's here. He finally hits on something to get Jesus to speak. In the middle of verse 61, again, the high priest, Caiaphas, was questioning him and saying to him, "Are you the Christ? Are you the Messiah, the Son of the Blessed One?" Well, for Jesus, that's an underhand, slow pitch. That's an easy question to hit. Are you the Messiah, the priest asks. Are you the Son of God? Yes or no, Jesus? Let's get right down to it. This gets Jesus to speak. And he says, "I am." His self-declaration of deity right there in open court. I am the Son of God, he declares. I am. Now, in Mark's gospel, there's only 3 times that Jesus is correctly identified in his full glory as the Messiah, the Son of God. The first is by a demon, if you recall. The last 2 are by the 2 people that end up murdering Jesus, the high priest and the centurion who oversaw his execution. They are the 2 people that identify him as the Son of God. You should marvel at the fullness of this declaration from the high priest. He gets it right. Are you the Messiah? Are you the Son of God? He declares. He knows. It's one of the most Christologically clear statements in all of the Gospels. It is the most clear and complete statement about Jesus' identity in Mark's Gospel, and it's from the man who's going to execute him. Are you the Messiah, he asks? I am. Are you the Son of God, he asks, and Jesus says, I am. Remember, this is from the parable of the vineyard workers. Jesus had already said he was the son of the vineyard owner, and this man has put it together. And Jesus agrees with him. So providential and ironic that God had the lead accuser be the one that confesses Jesus' identity in open court. Jesus is not simply content to say, I am. He goes on. You will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of power, coming with the clouds of heaven. That is not ambiguous. That is Jesus fully applying Old Testament passages about his deity to himself. Daniel 7 verse 13 says the Son of Man uses it as a description of God's power. Psalm 110 verse 1, the Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand until I put your enemies under your feet. That's what Jesus is referencing here. He is fully declaring not only that he is the Son of God, he is the one who will judge them. He is the one with God's power to sit in judgment on their souls. In their elevated benches right now, they are acting as the judge and treating Jesus like the criminal. The reality is flipped. They are the criminals, they are the blasphemers, and Jesus will judge them. He is going to come back in power. He's going to come back in great glory, and he will trample over them. He's going to come back, Revelation says, with the word justice engraved on his side. He's going to come back with his sword, and he is going to trample out their blood. They will be judged by God for this blasphemy that they are committing right here. And it will be Jesus that bears that judgment. He is the true judge. They are the ones in contempt. They are the ones committing blasphemy. They are the ones deserving of death. And he will let this trial play out for now. But he will have the eternal word. Well, that's his defense. Now let's go to the verdict, that Jesus will get what he deserves. Jesus will get what he deserves. Verse 63. Tearing his clothes, the high priest said, what further need do we have of witnesses? Now remember, if a judge was involved in the gathering of evidence, they could not be involved in hearing the trial. Moreover, every accusation had to be brought by 2 or 3 witnesses. This judge is saying, this is so clear, let's dispense with the whole thing. All 71 of us heard this blasphemy. We don't need to go on. It's over. He's guilty. And he rips his robes. Now, we talked about this back in Mark chapter 5, but the Pharisees had these pre-ripped robes. They were professional mourners. It was to show everybody how angry they were at something, but they bought the robes pre-ripped, just stitched up that was easy to shred. Somebody told me earlier today that Jews today in Israel still have a similar kind of thing. You can buy shirts for funerals with ribbons that are pre-cut, so you can tear the ribbons off of your shirt that are all designed for it. That's what they had during this time. It reminds me of the pants that basketball players wear. They warm-up pants. They rip off before they go into the game. I was so disappointed when I found out they had snaps down the side. I thought those guys were so strong. No, there's buttons. That's the kind of robe that Caiaphas is wearing here. It's pre-ripped so he can give this false outrage. Remember, for Caiaphas, this is not about blasphemy. Caiaphas doesn't care about blasphemy. It's all about the money. His temple operation is slipping because Jesus is a threat. That's it. I mean, they didn't come in here concerned about blasphemy. Any charge would do. In fact, when they turn him over to the Roman government to execute him, do you remember? They don't even charge him with blasphemy. They tell Pilate, well, he told people not to pay taxes to Caesar. That's the charge they deliver over to Pilate. Are you kidding? That didn't even come up at his trial. It has nothing to do with it. This is fake outrage from a heart that is in love with money. Verse 64, he goes on, you've heard the blasphemy. How does it seem to you? He asked the other judges. Remember, the high priest was supposed to vote last. Here he says, you've heard this. He's got to be guilty. What do you all think? He asked the judges. Well, of course. Of course. And so verse 64 says the obvious. They all condemned him to be deserving of death. He's going to die. He'll get what he deserves. Some begin to spit at him. They blindfolded him. They beat him with their fists. They said to him, prophesy. Matthew lets us know what they actually did is they blindfolded him. And the judges would be patrolling the floor of the court with their clubs. They come in and they're hitting him from different sides and telling him, prophesy, which one of us hit you? And the Sanhedrin is on this court. The Sadducees are on this court. The Sadducees don't believe in prophecy. The whole thing is ironic to them. Now let's see you say who's hitting you. And the officers received him. That's that technical word for taking him into custody. He's turned over to the bailiffs, and they didn't receive him with handcuffs. They received him with slaps in the face. They beat him. It's obvious that Jesus is getting what he didn't deserve here. That's clear. But I want you to go one step deeper. It's not only that he's getting what he doesn't deserve. You need to appreciate that he is getting what you deserve. He here, even here in the courtroom, is in the act of substitution. That act began in the garden. It was in the garden where our sins were being imputed to him. It was in the garden where separation from the Father is becoming a reality. It's in the garden where God made him who knew no sin to be sin on our behalf. And that's what's being played out in this trial. Jesus is being treated with the full weight of the law, even more so, because he is a sinner. Even though he never sinned, he was completely sinless. But he is taking our place. This is the stroke of miscarried, misapplied justice. It's miscarried and misapplied because this is the consequence for our sin. The wages of sin is death. This is the government's instrument of death. Physical death and spiritual death, both. And Jesus is going to face both of those realities. He is going to face the full eternal punishment for sin is going to be poured out on him. Only an eternal being could bear that. But he is also receiving the physical punishment for sin that he never committed. Understand that you will never experience God's wrath on sin personally because he poured it out on Jesus. If you put your faith in Jesus Christ, he is in your place here. He's in your place with the strokes that people gave him, and he's in your place with the stroke that God gives him. The lashes given by human hands are in your place. The lash given by God's hands. Zechariah 13, that God will strike the shepherd. All of that is in our place. So that we won't experience this punishment from God because he took it for us. This is a complete miscarriage and travesty of justice here. It's appalling. But it's also substitutionary. Because we will never face the full effect of our sin. But Jesus did.